Okay, welcome to CD number 6, property tax, what it is and how to reduce your tax bills to nil. So first of all, define what sort of taxes you have to pay as being a landlord. There are two types of taxes, are income tax and capital gains tax. So income tax is defined as taxable rental income less allowable expenditure. Now, you're only liable for income tax if you make an income, a profit. So pretty much it's your revenue, or in this case the rent, less expenses will give you the profit. And what you have in regards to tax is that you have taxable rental income, so rent that is liable for tax, less allowable expenditure. So you're allowed certain expenditure items to offset against your income to give you a profit, which is then the taxable profit, which then they apply a tax rate to. So that's what income tax is. Income tax is the rate of tax they apply to your taxable profit that you've made in your tax year, which you define as whichever year end you want to do. So I do my year as the tax year, which is the 5th of April every year. So that's taxable income, that's income tax. Then capital gains tax is the profit you make on buying and selling of the property. Capital gains tax is defined as selling price less purchase price. Now you'll get into more detail about that, what the selling price is and what cost you can allow against the selling price to lower the amount that you've got as the selling price, and also the costs of purchasing the property and the cost that you can allow to offset against the selling price that you've sold the property for. So we look at ways of minimizing the selling price and maximizing the purchase price so that you have an overall lower gain. So if you've bought a property for 100k and you've sold it for 200k, then your capital gains is 100,000, and then you pay tax on that, and there are various allowances you can use to offset against that gain so you can pay little tax on that. So let's move on to the first one about income tax. Now, so if we're trying to minimize your income tax bill, the idea is that we've got to minimize your taxable rental income and maximize allowable expenditure. So minimizing taxable rental income, the only way you can really do that is if rent that you applied to your accounts was never received, then you could charge that as a bad debt. So the rules are of the Inland Revenue is that you have to, even if you don't receive the rent, you still have to charge that rent as taxable rental income. But if it further plays out that the tenant doesn't pay the rent, then you can not charge that. Minimizing your taxable rental income is very difficult to do. If you receive rent, you have to charge it against your accounts, so there's not much we can do there. The real tricks are maximizing allowable expenditure. Now, allowable expenditure is defined as any cost you incur for the sole purposes of earning business profits, and capital allowance on the cost of buying a capital asset, or a wear and tear allowance for furnished lettings. So let me explain what that is. Now, any cost you incur for the sole purpose of earning business profits. The Inland Revenue deem that any expense you incur wholly, necessarily and exclusively for the business is fully deductible from your rental income. So really, if you incur any expense for the sole purpose of making a profit, then that can be deemed as a business expense. So you have to make sure that you have got all these expenditures that are being applied to your taxable rental income. Now I'll go through the list of what they are. The expenses that you can fully offset against your rental income is repairs and maintenance, finance charges, legal and professional fees, council tax, electricity, water and gas, that's if you pay it, insurance, advertising, ground rent and service charges, letting agents fees and stationery expenses. Now I'll go into detail about each one of those. Repairs and maintenance. Now, as long as you're not modifying a property, then any expense that you apply to a property with regards to repairs is fully chargeable against your taxable rental income. So painting and decorating, damp treatment, roof repairs, etc., then you can apply all those costs against your income fully. So make sure you put the whole amount on that. Finance charges, so that's like interest costs. So any loans that you've taken out to buy the property or repair the property, or taken out as deposits for acquiring the property, then you can charge the interest element only, so not the capital, just the interest. So if you're unsure of how much interest you've paid at the whole repayment, then you can usually find that on the statements that you get annually from your lender, and that will say the amount of interest. Now all my mortgages are interest only, but some of the unsecured loans that I've taken out there, that you have to pay the capital back as well, so only the interest element is chargeable to rental income. Okay, legal and professional fees, so any kind of fees that you've used in collecting rent, so letting agency fees, accountancy fees, any fees for evicting tenants, you can charge against your rental income, but you can't charge any legal fees that you've spent to acquire a property, because that's to do with acquisition costs, which is to do with capital gains tax, which we'll talk about later. But pretty much any kind of fees that have been used to collect the rent or account for the rent, then you can charge that against the rent. Okay, council tax, electricity, water and gas. Now if you're running the property as a HMO, you may be paying for the council tax, all the bills, etc. Now you can charge that against your income, because this expenditure has been solely incurred due to the renting of the property, so you've got no worries about charging that. Insurance, so you've got buildings insurance, contents insurance, rental guarantee insurance, any kind of insurance that you've got that is insuring the property or the contents or the rent that you receive, you can charge that against taxable rental income. Advertising, so any advertising costs you've got, newspaper ads, advertising on the internet, anything that you've incurred to advertise the property, printing costs, well, we'll go on to printing later, but any kind of the cost to do with advertising property you can charge. Ground rent and service charges, so that's applicable for properties that are leasehold, so you might have to pay a service charge and ground rent, so any of those costs are fully tax deductible again. Letting agents fees, so if you've paid for a letting agent to find a tenant, to collect the rent, any kind of fee that you've paid there, you can charge against rental income. Stationery, all sort of postage, printing expenditure, paper and envelopes, printing up the tenancy agreements, anything like that, you can fully charge against your income. Now the next lot of expenditure that I'm going to say is only partly tax deductible, so you can't charge the full amount, but you have to work out an apportionment of the cost to charge against your rental income. Now the most obvious one is motor expenses. Now you're going to have a car, you don't have the car solely for the purpose of having a property portfolio. I mean, unless you had a van and your main income was coming from property, then you could convince the Inland Revenue of that, but more than likely you've got a car, you're going to use it for other things like shopping, etc. So you can charge an apportionment to your portfolio. Now you have to determine that. Now one way you can determine that is if you do 200 miles a week and 50 of those miles are to do with handling your portfolio, then you can charge 25% of the cost of owning that motor. So that would be car insurance, fuel, servicing and repairs, and interest on the loan taken out to acquire the car. So it can be a sizable chunk that you can utilise against your taxable rental income. Another one is telephone calls, so you may use your mobile phone or landline to speak to tenants, etc. So you can charge part of the calls, part of the line rental, based on the rough percentages of how much you use for managing your portfolio. Now there are no hard and fast rules. Now you just got to be reasonable. I've never heard of the Inland Revenue coming in and auditing someone's mobile phone bill to check that they've applied the correct percentage. As long as you're sensible. Now if you're going to start saying, oh, I'll charge 90% of my mobile phone bill to managing your portfolio, unless it was a dedicated line, you're going to have trouble convincing the Inland Revenue. But you've got to be honest in what you're really using on the phone, and if it is 50%, 60%, then that's fair enough, and as long as you can back it up, then there should be no problem. Okay, and then the next one is capital allowances of the cost of buying a capital asset, or wear and tear allowance for furnished lettings. Like capital allowances, now that is where you can apply 25% of the cost of the asset against your profits. So the obvious one that springs to mind is the car. You say you bought a car for £5,000 and 20% usage of that car is to manage your portfolio, then you can allow £1,000 of the cost of that asset times 25%, which is the capital allowance amount. So you could charge £250 against your rental income just because you've got that car and you use it when you're in your business and managing a portfolio. So you could apply £250 again, where some people miss that out on their tax form, but that's something that will lower your taxable rental income. and also things like computers, printers, etc. Anything that's an asset is defined as anything that you're going to own longer than a year. So if you've got something that you use in the business, you intend to own it longer than a year, you can charge 25% of that, the cost of that asset times the usage that you use towards that business. So don't forget that one. Now, regards to allowances on furnished lettings, you can either do one of two things. You can either charge 25% of the cost of the furniture against the profit, or you can charge 10% of the rent, but it's up to you. But once you decide which way you're doing it, you can't change it. So you can't pick and choose in each year. If you've spent more on furniture, then you want to charge 25%, and then the following year charge 10% of rent. So you have to choose which one you want to elect for, and then based on that, that's the way you do it from then on. Now, I always, if I do furnished lettings, I used to do it occasionally, I used to just charge 10% of the rent, but now I don't bother because I don't do furnished lettings. But if you're going to do it, I would elect for the 10% of rent. Okay, so now you've got capital gains tax. Now that's all about the profit you make on the sale of the asset. So if you've bought an asset, as I said, for 100k and you've sold it for 200k, you've made 100k profit. Now what you want to do is reduce the selling price and maximize the purchase cost to give you the lowest gain possible. Now the allowable costs that you can offset against the selling price is any estate agency fees, any advertising costs, any solicitors costs, any valuation fees that you may have paid on the other side, any HIPS costs that you would have done to enable the sale, any cost involved in making the sale arise, you can offset against that selling price. So you may have about £5,000 worth of cost there that you could offset, for example, against a £200,000 selling price. So then you'd have the net selling price, or also known as net proceeds, of 195,000 now to offset against that 100k purchase price. But then when we look up the purchase price, you can again offset valuation fees, legal fees, any mortgage broker fees, any redemption penalties that you have to pay on clearing the mortgage as you sell it. Stamp duty is allowed as a tax deductible expenditure. So then you could have the purchasing costs could be £107,000. So now what you do is you have 195 as the net proceeds, the purchase cost of 107, so that reduces the capital gain to 88,000. So you brought it down from 100 to 88,000, and then that 88,000 is then subject to what's known as your personal allowance, and you're allowed roughly about £10,000 capital gains every year tax free. So you would apply that £10,000 to that 88 to reduce down to £78,000, and that is what you pay tax on. And the tax rate you pay now is a flat rate of 18%. It used to be based on your marginal rate, which was, you know, the rate or whatever you paid your income tax on, but now it's just a flat 18%, and so you would pay 18% on that 78,000. There are a couple of tricks you can employ in this. Now, one of them is you can, just before the day of sale, you can gift your partner, now that could be your wife or your living partner, half the property, and then when you sell it you can utilise your partner's allowance of £10,000. So in that example you had an £88,000 gain. Now just a day before the sale you give it to your partner, and then that means you, off the 88 gain, you then have the £10,000 personal allowance that you've got, and then £10,000 allowance that your partner's got, and that reduces the gain down to 68,000, and you'll save yourself a nice amount there. So that's one way of reducing your capital gains tax bill. The other way is your principal place of residence. Now if this property was your principal place of residence and then you'd let it out and then you'd sold it, the Inland Revenue deems the last 3 years as if you lived in it. So if you'd only rented it out for 3 years, then you've got no tax to pay. If you'd rented it out for 5 years, then 2 out of the 5 years you would make 2/5. They'd only charge 2/5 of the gain to the 18%, and that's even after all your allowances. So if you ever lived in that property and rented it out, make sure that you claim your principal place of residence relief, because that can pretty much reduce your tax bill to zero. Okay, now we're at part 2 of the CD, which is all about how to use your scientific calculator, which is included with this program, and how you can use that to calculate certain variables that are really important, that's really helped me in evaluating the performance and the quality of the property investments that I look at. So I'm going to teach you how to calculate yield, capital growth, the mortgage payment, profit, return on capital employed, the future value of a property in X years at Y inflation rate, future value of rent, future value of equity, and future value of profit. So the first calculation that I think is very key, which I've spoken about previously, is yield. Now I want you to get your calculator out and first of all learn how to calculate yield. Now that yield, as I've defined, as annual rent divided by purchase price. So now let's say, for example, we've got a property that rents out for £500 a month and the purchase price is £100,000. Then what we do is we type in the bracket figure. So if you see there, it's on the right hand side of the calculator, the grey button, first row above the numbers. It's like a bracket, the first open bracket. If you press that, then type in 500 and then times 12 and then close bracket, and then you divide it, press the divide button by 100,000. So type in 100,000, you should get a figure that says 0.06, 0.06. Yep. Then what you do is you times that by 100 and that will give you the yield, and there it says 6, so that equals 6% yield. So all you do is you multiply the rent by 12 with using the bracket facility on the calculator, and then divide it by the purchase price and then times it by 100, and that gives you the yield. Now the next calculation that I want you to do is called capital growth. Now that tells you how much growth you've experienced based on the purchase price and the value now. So let's use examples, right? If we've got a property that's we bought for 200,000 and it's now worth 250,000, then the capital growth percentage that we work out is, you do the brackets again, open the brackets, 250, so that's what it's worth, less what you bought it for, 200, right? So close bracket, and then you express that as a number relative to what you bought it for. So that 250 minus 200 has come out as 50, and then you divide it by 200, and that gives you 0.25, and then you times that by 100, and that will give you 25%. So that's how you work out the capital growth that you've experienced. Is basically the gain, the 250 minus the 200, which is 50, expressed as a percentage relative to what you paid for. So that 50 you divide by 200, which gives you 0.25, and then you times that by 100, so you've made a 25% gain, a 25% capital growth. Okay, the next one is mortgage payment. So if you want to work out what the monthly mortgage payment is on a property, then it's very simple. All you do is you get the interest rate, you get how much you're borrowing, and you divide it by 12. So this will best work for an example. Now let's just say you're buying a property that's valued at 100,000, you're getting 85% borrowings on it, and you're paying a 5% interest rate. Then what you do is you first of all open bracket, you do 5% interest rate divided by 100, close bracket, times open bracket 85%, so which is 85 divided by 100, close bracket, then you times it by the actual purchase price, which I said was 100,000, so you type in 100,000, and then you divide that by 12 because you've got 12 months in a year. So your mortgage payment works out as £354.16. So I hope you can see that. It's just basically the interest rate times the loan to value rate times the purchase price divided by 12, and that will give you the interest only payment. If you want to work out how to do the mortgage payment with a capital element in it, so it's a repayment amount, then visit my site ahuja.co.uk. There's a calculator on there, because you can't do that using the scientific calculator. You need a program to do that. Okay, so that's how you work out the mortgage payment. Now if you wanted to work out the profit you would make off that, then that's simply the rent minus the mortgage payment. So let's just say, for example, the rent was 500, then you would do £500 less £354.16, and that will give you the profit of £146 roughly. Okay, the next calculation is return on capital employed. Now that is the profit you've made relative to the amount of money you've put in. So I've just told you the profit is £146. Now this is an annual figure. So what you do is you multiply the profit by 12 and you express that as a percentage relative to how much money you've put in. So let's just say, using again the same figures, we would do 140, so we do open bracket 146 times 12 close bracket, and then we would divide that by, and then so if we bought this on an 85% mortgage, we would have put 15% in, so we would do divided by open bracket 15 divided by 100 times the 100,000, because that would have put 100,000 in close bracket, and that equals 0.1168. so then we times that by 100, and that equals 11.68%. so that means off the £15,000 we put in, we got a return of 11.68% in the year, which is pretty much expressing the annual profit by the amount of money you've put in. So the annual profit was 146 times 12, which equals 1,752, and expressing that relative to how much you put in, which was 15,000, is around about 11.68% return. Now moving on to the future value of a property in X years at Y inflation rate. Now you might want to know what the value of a property would be in X years time at Y inflation rate. So let's just again use an example. We wanted to know, let's assume that property prices grow at roughly 3%, which is pretty much what Nationwide and Halifax find that the growth is. So you've got an inflation rate of 3%, and you want to know what a property you bought for 100 grand today is worth in 10 years time. So what you would do, you would type in, so at 3% interest rate, 3 divided by 100. So what you would do is 3 divided by 100, which equals 0.03. Now what you do is you add 1. Always add 1 in whenever you're doing this calculation, so you get a figure of 1.03. so if you was doing a 5% interest rate, it would be 1.05. if it was a 1% interest rate, it would be 1.01. so basically that will give you the figure that you now have to do what's called raise it to the power of. Now you raise it to the power of the number of years, which we've said in this example is 10 years. So you would look for the button that says YX. So if you look on your calculator, there's a button in grey just above the 8 which says YX. So you press that and then put the figure in of 10, and that should equal 1.34391. Now that is what you call the multiplier. Now you multiply the purchase price of whatever you've paid for that property to give you the future value of what that property is. So that is, in this example, is 100,000. So what we'd have is we times 100,000 by that 1.34391, and that gives you 134,391. So assuming a 3% inflation rate, we would see that property be valued at 134,391 in 10 years. So now we can work out what the future value of your equity would be of that property. Now if you bought that property with an 85% mortgage on 100 grand, that means you borrowed £85,000. so you would take that £85,000 and you would minus that from that. So you would take that 134,391 and you would take away 85,000, and that means that you could expect to have an equity of £49,391 in 10 years, assuming an inflation rate of 3%. and that's how you work it out. You always calculate that multiplier. And in the same way, you can use that multiplier effect that you can calculate the future value of rent and the future value of profit. So let's say you was getting £500 a month rent, you would take that multiplier again, that 1.34391, you'll times it by 500, and that will give you the rent of 671.95. So you just times 500 by 1.34391, and that will give you the rent of £671.95. Now you can take off what the mortgage payment that we calculated earlier is £354. You would take, now assuming this assumes interest rates stay the same, now they all hover around the 5%, so as long as you haven't remortgaged the property, you can expect your mortgage payment to be around about that £354 mark, because there's nothing to change that figure. So you would now have a future profit value of approximately 671 less 354 equals £317. So you can see quite nicely in 10 years time, using that multiplier, that you would be having an equity of roughly £49,000, which was the 134,391 less 85 grand, and a future profit in 10 years of £317 per month. Now this is all real money in 10 years time, so there will, their money will have less value, but it will still be considerably more than what you're making now, which is if you didn't buy the property, you'd have nothing. Now if you need help building a property portfolio, just give us a call on 0870 990 3205. That's 0870 990 3205. Thanks.